Welcome to another Detective Agatha Marple mystery, The Twilight Over St. Mead, a Detective Tales. If you are new to our channel, please do consider subscribing to us and giving us a like. If you enjoy this mystery thriller story, and if you are a regular, welcome back. The gaslight flickered uncertainly in Agatha Marple's sitting room, casting elongated shadows along the floral wallpaper. It was a modest yet elegant space. Bookshelves lined with neatly arranged volumes, an embroidered armchair positioned precisely for contemplation, and a small mahogany writing desk stacked with correspondence she had, for the time being, elected to ignore. Beyond the window, St. Mead's village square unfolded in quiet unease. The arrival of the circus had disrupted the well-rehearsed rhythms of the place, as if a foreign element had been introduced into a perfectly balanced equation. Beneath the glow of street lamps, figures moved with purpose and secrecy, their silhouettes wavering like half-formed thoughts in the misty evening air. Marple, seated with her customary composure, observed without interfering. Her delicate fingers rested lightly against the lace curtain as she surveyed the scene with the patience of a naturalist studying a new species in its habitat. Every detail was registered: the nervous glance exchanged between two men near the wagons, the sharp flicker of something metallic in a performer's hand before it vanished into his sleeve, the hesitant posture of a young woman who lingered at the edge of the square as if contemplating flight. It was, as always, the small things that mattered. She had learned long ago that truth rarely announced itself with fanfare. Rather, it whispered from the margins, hiding in the seemingly inconsequential. A careless word spoken too soon, a gesture that betrayed more than intended. These were the fragments of reality that, when assembled correctly, formed a picture quite different from the one presented at face value. Her gaze settled momentarily on the knife-thrower. He stood slightly apart from the others, his coat patched at the elbows, his eyes shadowed with something that might have been remorse. He was speaking to another man, shorter, broader, with a thick wool coat and a stiff manner. Their conversation was brief, but Marple noted the way the knife-thrower's fingers twitched toward the inside of his coat. A habit, perhaps, but an instinctive one. When the conversation ended, the second man turned abruptly and disappeared into the gloom, while the knife-thrower remained, his posture sinking slightly as if the weight of something unseen had pressed upon him. Marple's mind moved swiftly, sorting through past experiences. She had seen men like him before, men with guilt woven into the very fabric of their being. But guilt was a curious thing. It did not always belong to the crime suspected. Sometimes it preceded the act itself, waiting for the inevitable to occur. Outside, a gentle drizzle began to fall, soft and persistent. The gaslights wavered in the damp air, lending the village a dreamlike quality, as if reality had momentarily lost its footing. Marple let the curtain fall back into place and reached for her notebook, a small, unassuming volume in which she occasionally made note of things others might dismiss. She did not write anything yet, only tapped the pencil lightly against the edge of the desk. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay the circus a visit. Not as a spectator, such frivolities did not particularly interest her, but as an observer, where observation was most needed. There were secrets stirring beneath the brightly painted tents, secrets the respectable village of St. Mead was ill-equipped to handle, and secrets, Marple knew, had a way of turning into something altogether more dangerous. The air was thick with the scent of damp sawdust and oil lamps, as the circus whirled into motion beneath a sky devoid of stars. The grand tent, its once vivid stripes faded by time and travel, stood tall against the midnight gloom, its canvas rippling with the restless whisper of wind. Inside, lanterns swayed from the towering poles, casting elongated, flickering shadows that danced across the ring like ghostly spectres. The villagers of St. Mead, so accustomed to the predictability of their quiet lives, sat on wooden benches, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and unease. The circus was an oddity in their midst, a world that shimmered with impossible feats and unspoken secrets. At the center of it all stood the ringmaster, Tall and broad-shouldered, with a red waistcoat that gleamed under the shifting lights, he held his audience captive with the mere flick of his gloved hand. His voice, smooth and commanding, carried over the murmurs of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare to witness the impossible." With a theatrical bow, he stepped back, and the trapeze artist took flight. High above the ring, a figure dressed in silver and midnight blue soared, limbs extending in perfect, weightless arcs. Gasps rippled through the audience as she let go of the bar mid-swing, twisting through the air before catching her partner's waiting hands at the last possible moment. It was breathtaking, almost ethereal, a fragile moment of suspended reality. Yet, beneath the awe, something darker stirred. In the shadows beyond the golden light of the ring, the knife-thrower Rafferty stood with arms crossed, his gaze sharp, his jaw tense. A few yards away, Madame Claudine, the fortune-teller, observed with her customary knowing smile. Near the entrance, the burly strong man whispered something to one of the clowns, who nodded before slipping into the night. Something unseen hovered at the edges of the spectacle, threading tension through the very air. Then it happened. A shriek, sharp, raw, and wholly out of place in the controlled chaos of the circus, cut through the music, piercing the night like a jagged blade. For a moment silence followed. The trapeze artist, poised for her next leap, hesitated. The calliope wheezed into a discordant halt. The laughter of the audience dissolved into an unsettled murmur. And then came the movement, the collective lurch of bodies turning toward the sound. Behind the stage, past the tangle of ropes and forgotten props, a figure lay crumpled on the damp earth. Even in the dim light the identity was unmistakable. Lord Albert Witherspoon, an aristocrat whose presence was felt more in whispers than in grand declarations, lay motionless, his fine waistcoat marred by the unmistakable stain of blood. His face, frozen in an expression of shock, was turned just enough to catch the flickering glow of a lantern. For a moment no one moved. Then the panic set in. A woman screamed. Someone stumbled backward into a stack of wooden crates, sending them clattering noisily to the ground. The ringmaster, usually the master of control, rushed forward with a harshly barked order for calm, though his own face betrayed something close to alarm. From her seat at the edge of the audience, Agatha Marple did not rush forward like the others. Instead, she remained still, watching how the villagers reacted, how the performers moved, watching the way Rafferty's fingers flexed at his sides, the way Madame Claudine exhaled slowly, almost as if she had expected this moment to come. And most of all, she watched the body. Because, of course, there was one undeniable fact that would soon send St. Mary Mead into a spiral of suspicion, secrets, and revelations. Lord Witherspoon had been murdered. The body of Lord Albert Witherspoon lay awkwardly against the weathered boards of the backstage platform, his fine evening suit stark against the rough ink-drack wood. The lanterns swung above, their light uneven, catching the glint of something metallic just beneath the folds of his waistcoat. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of damp canvas, grease paint, and something sharper, the unmistakable tang of blood. Detective Agatha Marple, already present at the scene with the calm efficiency of one who had seen death before, crouched over the lifeless form, taking in the details with quiet, measured precision. She had long since learned that the first glimpse of a crime scene was often the most revealing, before confusion and well-meaning hands disturbed the truth. Her gaze flickered briefly to the aristocrat's face. Eyes half-lidded, mouth slightly open, as though caught mid-protest, a man surprised rather than afraid. It was not, however, the expression that caught her attention, but rather what lay beneath him. The boards where his body rested bore a peculiar marking, a faint yet deliberate symbol scorched into the wood. Marple tilted her head slightly, considering. Not an accident, then, and not the careless result of a stray ember from a performer's torch. No, this had been placed with purpose. Beside the body, half hidden in the shadow of a discarded prop, a towering painted moon from some forgotten act. A dagger gleamed in the dim light. The handle was plain, the blade long, the metal dark with something that might have been blood. Marple did not touch it. A weapon, certainly, but was it the weapon, or merely an offering placed for effect? Her lips pursed slightly in thought. Behind her a sharp intake of breath broke the heavy silence. A young man, no more than 20, his stage-hand's uniform slightly too large for his wiry frame, stood a few paces away, his hands trembling at his sides. His face, pale in the half-light, bore an expression of mingled fear and reluctant knowledge. Marple did not rise, nor did she turn sharply toward him. Instead, she adjusted her position ever so slightly, making it clear that she had noted his presence. "You saw something?" she said, her voice light, almost conversational. The young man swallowed hard. His gaze darted to the dagger, then to the strange marking beneath the victim, before finally landing on Marple's composed expression. For a moment it seemed as if he might bolt into the darkness, but some instinct, perhaps an understanding that flight would only deepen suspicion, kept him rooted to the spot. "I don't know," he stammered, though the words rang hollow. Marple exhaled softly through her nose, her patience undisturbed. She had encountered such nervous souls before, those who knew more than they were willing to admit but had not yet made peace with the burden of their knowledge. "Come now," she murmured, her gaze returning to the dagger. "We both know that isn't true." The young man's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening. It's not what it looks like," he burst out suddenly. "It's not—" He stopped himself, breathing heavily. Marple, still crouched beside the body, raised an eyebrow. "That is interesting." "Not what it looks like?" she repeated gently. "And what precisely does it look like to you?" The young man hesitated, his gaze flickering again to the dagger, to the symbol burned into the floor. He took a breath, as if to speak, but then, perhaps remembering something, perhaps fearing too much, he simply shook his head. Marple let the silence settle between them like a veil. The trick with such individuals was never to press too hard. They needed time to unburden themselves, to wrestle with the consequences of truth. She turned back to the body, noting the faintest disturbance in the dust near Lord Witherspoon's shoes. The kind of marks left when a body is dragged. Not far, but far enough. The aristocrat had not died where he had fallen. No, he had been placed here, and whoever had done so had wanted it to mean something. Outside, the circus remained in hushed, uneasy motion. The Calliope's broken melody had long since faded, and somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied nervously. But here, in the dim and claustrophobic space behind the stage, a far greater performance had already begun, one of deception, of secrets, of motives yet to be uncovered. Marple stood at last, dusting off her hands. There were many questions to be answered. Marple, and she fully intended to find them. The morning light filtered weakly through the stained canvas of the circus tent, casting a sallow glow upon the makeshift dressing-room. The air was thick with the lingering scent of grease paint, damp wood, and the faint acrid trace of last night's lantern smoke. A cracked mirror reflected the cramped space, its glass marred with streaks, doubling the disarray of costumes hanging from rusting hooks and half-packed trunks. Seated on a wooden stool, Detective Agatha Marple folded her gloved hands in her lap and regarded the man across from her with polite attentiveness. Rafferty, the knife-thrower, sat rigidly, his shoulders squared in a way that suggested he had long since learned to meet suspicion head-on. His lean frame seemed carved from something weathered and unyielding, yet his hands, calloused from years of handling blades, twitched ever so slightly as they rested on his knees. He had the look of a man who had already been accused of many things, and perhaps rightly so. "You'll forgive the intrusion, Mr. Rafferty," Marple said, her voice mild but firm, "but I find that early conversations often yield the most useful truths. People have not yet had time to decide what they wish to conceal." Rafferty exhaled sharply through his nose, a shadow of a smile flickering across his otherwise grim expression. "You've got the right of it, miss," he said, his voice roughened at the edges, as though long accustomed to shouting over a restless audience. "But I'll tell you plain, I had no quarrel with Lord Witherspoon. His kind rarely have much to do with mine." Marple inclined her head slightly, as though she had heard this assertion many times before. And indeed she had. "But you knew him," she prompted gently. Rafferty hesitated. "I knew of him," he amended. "He had dealings with the circus, same as he had dealings with half the village, if you ask the right people." He ran a hand through his dark hair, sending it into further disarray. "I came to this life young, Miss Marple. Wasn't much else for me. Picked up bad habits along the way, gambling mostly, drinking when the nights went long and the wages went short, and now—" "Now," he said, lifting his gaze to meet hers squarely, "I keep to myself, and I've spent a long time making sure I don't have to answer for the man I used to be." Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "The past has a way of lingering," she murmured, making a small notation in her leather-bound notebook. Rafferty let out a slow breath. "It does." "You were performing last night?" He nodded. "Right up until the scream. Then I went to see what the fuss was about, same as the rest." Marple's pencil moved deftly, recording the words without judgment. "And before that—" His hesitation was slight but noticeable. "In my tent," he said, then added, "alone." "A pity." The words were soft, almost kindly, yet Rafferty flinched as if she had struck him. Marple looked up, her blue eyes bright with something sharp and knowing. "You see, Mr. Rafferty, a man with no quarrel and no alibi is an unfortunate thing. People will talk, and once talk begins it rarely stops in the right place." Rafferty rubbed a hand over his jaw, considering her words. "People have been talking about me for years, Miss Marple. You get used to it." "Yet," Marple murmured, closing her notebook with a soft snap, "you still look as though you expect to be found guilty of something." Rafferty's jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now, more urgent. "Because it never matters, does it, what a man says or what he does after the fact? If people have decided he's the villain, that's all they'll see." Marple regarded him for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, she smoothed her gloves and rose from her seat. "I dare say there's truth in that," she conceded, "but truth and perception are rarely the same thing, and I prefer to work with the former." Rafferty stood as well, watching as she made her way to the exit. Just before she stepped out into the morning chill, she turned slightly. "One last thing, Mr. Rafferty. Did you notice anything unusual last night? Anything that seemed out of place before the murder?" He hesitated, then at last he nodded. "There was a man," he said. "Not one of ours. I saw him near the back entrance, speaking to Witherspoon." Marple's brows lifted slightly. "And do you know who he was?" Rafferty shook his head. "But I know trouble when I see it, Miss Marple, and that man, he was trouble." Marple gave a small, satisfied nod and, without another word, stepped out into the cool morning air. The threads were beginning to take shape. Now she need only untangle them. The drawing-room of Pendleton House was an impeccable vision of 1920s refinement. Dark mahogany panelling rose to meet intricately plastered ceilings, while a vast bay window framed the well-manicured garden outside, its hedges groomed to geometric precision. Overstuffed armchairs and an elegant fainting couch were arranged near the fireplace, the flames crackling softly as the morning sunlight streamed through sheer lace curtains. It was a room meant for civil discussions over tea, but today it hosted something far more tense, a delicate interrogation. Detective Agatha Marple sat in a high-backed chair, a writing pad balanced on her knees. Her demeanour was composed, her questions gentle but probing, each inquiry as measured as her carefully penned notes. Across from her, Lady Eleanor Pembroke, a celebrated fixture of local society, perched on the edge of the fainting couch. Lady Eleanor's fashionable cloche hat sat askew, and a faint flush tinged her cheeks, not entirely due to the fire's warmth. "I really must protest, Miss Marple," she said, waving a slender hand, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "I fail to see why you would think I have anything to contribute to this sordid affair. I barely knew Lord Witherspoon." Marple's pen paused, though she did not look up. "Forgive me, Lady Pembroke, but the point of these conversations is to establish exactly what everyone knew, or thought they knew, about Lord Witherspoon." Lady Eleanor drew herself up slightly, folding her gloved hands. What everyone knew, she repeated, her tone sharp. Indeed, everyone knew he was a man of influence, a man of, well, considerable means. She glanced at the fireplace, her eyes momentarily distant, before adding, Of course, that sort of power attracts all kinds, even the unsavoury. And yet, Martha murmured, one might wonder how such a gentleman found himself involved with the likes of a travelling circus. Lady Eleanor flinched. It was the smallest movement, a barely perceptible jerk of her chin, but it was enough. I wouldn't know, she said too quickly. Lord Witherspoon's dealings were not my concern. Marple studied her carefully. Lady Eleanor's expression was tight, her gloved fingers now twisting a handkerchief. It was a marked departure from the composed elegance she usually displayed at village fêtes and garden parties. Marple made a mental note. Perhaps not, she said lightly, but I understand he was known to favour your hospitality on occasion. Lady Eleanor's mouth tightened. Miss Marple, she said, her voice lower now, if you are insinuating anything inappropriate— Not at all, Lady Pembroke, Marple interrupted smoothly, her pencil poised once more. I merely wish to confirm the facts. Lady Eleanor hesitated. For a moment it seemed she might refuse to speak further, but then, with a soft sigh, she relented. I admit, she said reluctantly, that Lord Witherspoon occasionally visited Pendleton House. He sought advice on certain personal matters he wished to remain private. Of course, I obliged. One does not refuse a man of his standing. And these personal matters, Marple prompted, her tone steady. Would they have involved anyone connected with the circus? Lady Eleanor's flush deepened. She glanced away, her voice faltering. I wouldn't know. Marple allowed the silence to linger, watching as the socialite's carefully constructed poise began to crumble. Before she could press further, however, the door to the drawing-room creaked open. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped in. The ringmaster. His polished boots barely made a sound on the carpeted floor, and his tailored coat seemed almost too fine for his profession. He removed his top hat with a practised flourish, his expression one of polite curiosity. "Detective," he said, his voice as smooth as velvet. "I trust you don't mind my joining the discussion. I understand I am next on your list." Marple's face betrayed no surprise. "Not at all," she said, setting her notes aside. "I was just about to inquire after you." Lady Eleanor rose quickly, her composure returning in an instant. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice cool, "I believe you have all you need from me, Miss Marple." She swept from the room without a backward glance. The ringmaster watched her go, a faint smile playing at his lips. Then he turned to Marple and sat in the chair Lady Eleanor had vacated. "I can't imagine how I might assist you," he began smoothly, "but I am, of course, at your disposal." Marple studied him closely. His tone was pleasant, his movements unhurried, but there was something calculated in the way he held himself. His head tilted ever so slightly, a picture of calm control. "You've been with the circus for quite some time," Marple began. "Indeed. And I understand you were acquainted with Lord Witherspoon?" The ringmaster's smile remained, though his eyes darkened slightly. "Acquainted, yes, though I would hardly say we were friends. He was a man of means, interested in the arts. I believe he found our performances refreshing." "And yet," Marple said, her voice calm, "he also found himself backstage on the night of his death." The ringmaster's smile faltered just enough to be noticeable. He spread his hands. "An unfortunate coincidence, I'm sure." Marple raised an eyebrow. "You were there as well?" "Of course," he said smoothly. "I'm the ringmaster. It is my duty to ensure the performance runs smoothly, to keep an eye on things. Or perhaps," Marple suggested, her tone still mild, "to keep certain things hidden." For the first time the ringmaster's composure cracked. It was a fleeting moment. His mouth tightened, his shoulders tensed. But Marple saw it. "I assure you," he said, his voice quieter now, "I have nothing to hide." Marple smiled faintly, her gaze never wavering. "We shall see." The Bell and Rose tea-room was a picture of serene order. Its polished tables and well-dusted shelves displayed tins of loose-leaf tea, each labelled in tidy handwriting, while a faint floral aroma wafted through the air. Outside, rain tapped gently against the leaded windows, adding a hushed rhythm to the quiet murmur of conversation within. At a small table near the corner, Agatha Marple sat with a notebook open before her. A simple teacup rested at her elbow, the steam curling upward in soft spirals. Her pencil moved slowly, precisely, capturing the words of those who sat opposite her. One by one, the witnesses, circus performers and townsfolk alike, tried to explain where they had been on the night of the murder. "I was at the fortune-teller's tent," said Madame Claudine, her French accent delicate yet firm. She sat with her hands folded neatly, her expression serene. "She reads the cards for me sometimes. I find it soothing before a performance." Marple looked up, her blue eyes cool and direct. "And what time would that have been, madame?" "Oh, just after the main act ended," Claudine replied smoothly. "Perhaps a little past midnight, I cannot recall precisely." Across the table, a younger performer, one of the tumblers, fidgeted nervously with the brim of his cap. "That's not right," he blurted, then hesitated when all eyes turned toward him. I saw Madame Claudine leaving the tent just before midnight, I'm sure of it." Claudine turned a slow, deliberate gaze toward him. "You are mistaken," she said evenly. The tumbler swallowed hard. "No, I remember because I was fetching my costume and I passed by the tent. You weren't inside." Marple's pencil paused, then resumed its steady path. She made no comment, but the slight curve of her mouth suggested she was listening very closely. The ringmaster, seated at the next table, leaned back in his chair, his polished cane resting against his leg. "There's no sense in all this squabbling," he said smoothly. "What's important is that no one saw anything unusual before the tragedy." "Except," Marple interjected without looking up, "you told me earlier that you noticed Lord Witherspoon speaking with someone near the supply wagons before the performance ended. A tall man in a dark coat, wasn't it?" The ringmaster's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened briefly on the arm of his chair. "I may have been mistaken," he said after a pause. "It was dark, after all, and I was busy making sure everything was running smoothly." "Of course," Marple murmured, her pencil scratching against the page. From the far side of the room, a member of the stage crew, stocky, with grease still smeared on his sleeves, spoke up. "I don't know about any tall man, but I saw the knife-throw Rafferty hanging around back there. Looked like he was waiting for someone." Marple glanced at him. "And what time was this?" "About midnight, maybe a bit before." The tumbler frowned. "That can't be right. I saw Rafferty by the main tent then." "You're imagining things," the stagehand shot back. "Am I?" Marple's pencil paused again. Her gaze swept the table, moving from one face to another. Madame Claudine's serene calm now seemed slightly brittle. The tumbler shifted uneasily under the stagehand's glare. The ringmaster had turned his attention to his cane, running a thumb along the polished wood. The discrepancies were small but telling. A minute difference here, a conflicting recollection there, the tiniest changes in tone when a name was mentioned. They were threads in a tapestry of misdirection, and Marple was certain that somewhere among these threads lay the truth. Behind the calm surface of the tea-room, something else simmered, a tension that rippled just beneath their words. It wasn't just the fear of being accused. There was loyalty, yes, but also something darker, secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Marple folded her notebook and tucked it away. She reached for her teacup, sipping quietly as the conversation faltered into uneasy silence. When she finally spoke again, her voice was light, almost offhand. "It's funny, isn't it, how memory can play tricks on us? The same moment, seen from different angles, becomes entirely different stories." The others said nothing. The sound of rain tapping against the windows seemed louder now. Marple smiled faintly, though her eyes remained sharp. "Of course," she added, "not everyone's memory is at fault. Sometimes the truth is simply more inconvenient than the lie." She rose then, adjusting her coat and gloves, and bid them good day. Behind her, the tension in the room lingered, as if her departure had left a thread pulled loose. threatening to unravel everything. The night was silent, but for the occasional rustle of wind through the hedgerows and the creak of an old weather vane atop a crumbling warehouse. Detective Agatha Marple moved quietly, her footsteps muffled against the damp earth. She had followed a faint trail of whispers and flickering light, each step drawing her closer to the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, where the circus grounds met the more unkempt, forgotten corners of the village. The warehouse loomed before her, its once solid stone walls now streaked with moss and its wooden doors hanging slightly askew. From a crack in the weathered boards, a faint wavering glow spilled into the dark. It was not the steady light of an oil lamp, nor the cold glimmer of moonlight. It was something else, something unsettling. Marble kept to the shadows as she approached. Her practical shoes pressed softly against the ground, and her breath came slow and even. Peering through a gap in the boards, she took in the scene before her. A group of 5 individuals, faces obscured by the angles of their hoods and the dim light, stood in a loose circle around a small lantern. The lantern's flame flickered irregularly, casting strange, distorted shadows that danced on the cracked stone floor. Their movements were deliberate, synchronized, as if following a pattern known only to them. A low voice murmured something indistinct, and the others replied in unison. The words were foreign, rhythmic, and tinged with a cadence that made Marple's skin prickle. She caught snatches of phrases: the ancient pact, the blood that binds, the offering renewed. One figure stepped forward, holding something small and glinting in the lantern's glow. It might have been a token, or perhaps a key. The murmuring grew softer, their voices dipping into an almost melodic chant. Marple strained to hear, her mind racing. The symbols burned into the floorboards of the murder scene had been strange, geometric. At the time she had wondered if they were meant as a crude attempt at misdirection, a flourish of theatricality to muddy the waters. But now, as her ears caught the repeated cadence, she recognized a phrase that matched one of those symbols. An ancient glyph she had come across only once before, in a forgotten volume buried in the village library's dusty archives. Oculos tenebrarum, she whispered to herself, the words sending an involuntary shiver down. She had not given much weight to the idea of a cult before. Cults were, after all, the stuff of melodramatic penny dreadfuls, not something she had encountered in her practical line of work. But there was no mistaking what she saw now. This was not simply a group of performers gathered for a clandestine meeting. It was something far older, something that tied the circus's wandering roots to rituals and secrets she could not yet fully comprehend. The chant rose slightly, then abruptly ceased. The figures stood still, their heads bowed, as if listening for some unseen command. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing. Marple knew it was time to retreat before her presence was discovered. She moved carefully back along her path, ensuring that not a single step would betray her. The air felt colder now, the stillness of the night more oppressive. Once safely out of earshot, Marple paused to steady herself. The logical part of her mind tried to dismiss what she had witnessed as mere theatrics, eccentric performers dabbling in the occult for their own amusement, perhaps. But she knew better. There had been a purpose in their words, a gravity in their movements. And above all there had been that phrase, oculos tenebrarum, woven into the fabric of both the ritual and the crime scene. It was no longer a question of whether the circus's mysterious past played a role in Lord Witherspoon's murder. It was now a question of how deeply that past reached into the present, and how many of those within the circus and the village were complicit in keeping that darkness alive. The backstage corridor was a world apart from the painted illusions of the main tent. The peeling mirror, propped against a scuffed wooden wall, reflected not the glamorous image of a showman, but a man worn thin by his own ghosts. Rafferty stood alone, his back to the corridor's faint lamplight, gazing into the glass as if searching for something that had long since vanished. He removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark, unkempt hair, his fingers pausing at the faint scar just above his temple, a reminder of the fight that had changed everything. For a moment the present slipped away, and his thoughts drifted back to the crowded tavern, where the sound of breaking glass and shouted accusations had erupted into chaos. He could still feel the rough hands grabbing his collar, the bitter taste of blood in his mouth, and the voice, her voice, cutting through it all with a single word: "Stop!" But she hadn't stopped them. She hadn't stopped anything. The mirror was unforgiving, its surface warped enough to twist his features just slightly out of true. He looked down at his hands, the calluses thick and unyielding. They had held knives, cards, coins that didn't belong to him. They had taken lives. Not in the way the law might define it, but in a way Rafferty could never quite shake. Quiet betrayals, cold choices made when no one else was looking. He tightened his jaw, the memory of his worst moment rushing back in sharp detail. He had trusted someone once, someone who'd smiled and promised redemption. Instead, they'd left him holding the blame, watching as they walked away untouched, their pockets lined with stolen cash and their reputation intact. It had nearly destroyed him. Nearly. Rafferty inhaled deeply, steadying himself. That was years ago. He had tried to leave that life behind. The circus had given him a chance to rebuild, to prove, if only to himself, that he could be more than the shadows of his past. Yet, no matter how many nights he stood in the ring and watched his blades fly true, he could never quite silence the doubt. And now this. A murder. A dead aristocrat. A fresh wave of suspicion and whispers. Rafferty felt the weight of it all settle on his shoulders. Heavier than his old satchel of knives, he clenched his fists, turning away from the mirror. He didn't want to see himself any more. As he paced the narrow corridor, his mind raced. Had someone from his past come back to haunt him? Or was this chaos of a different sort, unconnected to the sins he thought he'd buried? He replayed every glance, every word exchanged over the past week, searching for something he'd missed. A creak in the floorboards behind him made him pause. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching, but the corridor was empty. Silent, except for the faint hum of the lantern. He rubbed the scar on his temple and exhaled slowly. If he could clear his name, if he could prove that he had no part in this, perhaps then the weight would lift. Perhaps then he could look into a mirror and see more than regret staring back at him. Rafferty closed his eyes for a moment, summoning the calm he'd learned during his acts. That narrow, focused state of mind that allowed him to face a row of spinning targets without a single tremor in his hand. He would find the truth of this mess. He had to, because if he didn't, the lies of the past would swallow him whole. When he opened his eyes, the corridor was still empty, the mirror still cracked. But something inside him had shifted. He turned and walked back toward the main tent, his steps measured and steady, his mind set on the challenge ahead. In the modest confines of her lodging, Agatha Marple sat at her small desk, the oil lamp casting a warmth. Before her lay a collection of notes, hastily scribbled observations and a creased, hand-drawn map of the circus grounds. The faint, rhythmic ticking of an old clock on the mantel punctuated the silence, a steady reminder that time was slipping away. She adjusted her glasses, leaned forward and studied the symbols she had transcribed days ago. They were odd, geometric shapes that at first glance seemed nothing more than an artist's idle doolings, yet Marple's instincts had told her otherwise. Something about their repetition, the same shapes, the same angular lines, hinted at a hidden logic. She thought back to the scorched markings beneath Lord Witherspoon's body, then to the faint etchings on the underside of a wooden crate found backstage. And there it was again, the same symbol she had glimpsed in the dim glow of that clandestine meeting near the warehouse. Her pencil tapped softly against the edge of the desk as her mind assembled the pieces. The map before her became more than a diagram. It became a stage, the backstage corridor, the strongman's tent, the fortune-teller's wagon, and that dilapidated warehouse. She pictured them not as disconnected points, but as part of a greater design, a thread that tied the circus together with something far older, something buried in the village's history. The flashbacks came swiftly. The young tumbler's nervous hesitation, the ringmaster's too-smooth dismissal of questions, Rafferty's pained confession. Each recollection played out against the backdrop of the tents and wagons, the stolen glances, the furtive movements after dark. Small details Marple had noted without fully understanding their significance. Until now, the symbols were not random, nor were they merely decorative. They marked points of contact, meeting places for those who operated in the shadows. They formed a path, one that led straight to the hidden room she had found in Lord Witherspoon's study, the secret compartment within the bookshelf, the dusty journal filled with cryptic references to the eye and the offering. The symbols there matched the ones etched in the circus's forgotten corners. Marple's lips tightened into a thin line. She reached for her notebook, flipping back through her earliest notes. There, in her neat handwriting, was a fragment of a name mentioned in one of the victim's letters, a name she now recognized from the chant she had overheard. The clock ticked on. The room had begun to scatter at the clocks of her pencil. Her thoughts, once scattered, had begun to coalesce. The circus had long seemed a world of illusion, but beneath its gaudy surface lay a pattern too precise to ignore. Marple set down her pencil and removed her glasses. She rubbed her temples, allowing herself a brief moment of rest. Her next step would be crucial. The symbols, the places, the faces, they had led her to the heart of the mystery. Now she had to decide how best to confront it. Outside, the moon cast a pale, cold light over St. Mary Mead, illuminating the quiet streets. The village slept on, blissfully unaware of the dark truths emerging from its shadow. But Marple's work was not yet done, and as the clock ticked on, she prepared herself for the revelations to come. The garden at Blackthorn Manor was still and expectant beneath the moonlight, the silver beams casting long shadows over the neatly clipped hedges and fragrant rose bushes. In the centre of the garden, a small stone fountain trickled softly, its gentle sound providing a deceptive sense of calm. Around this fountain stood a disparate group, individuals drawn together not by choice, but by circumstance. Detective Agatha Marple, seated with a notebook in her lap, faced them with her usual composed demeanour. To her left was Lady Eleanor Pembroke, a scarf pulled tightly around her neck despite the mild night air. Next to her, the ringmaster leaned nonchalantly on his polished cane, though his eyes betrayed a wary tension. Rafferty, the knife-thrower, stood slightly apart, his arms crossed and his jaw set. He stared at the ground, a man seemingly resigned to his own inner turmoil. "Thank you all for coming," Marple began in her calm, precise manner. "I realize it must seem unusual to gather at such a time, but I assure you there is good reason." Her voice carried no urgency, yet each word seemed to draw the group tighter, their postures stiffening under her scrutiny. "You see," she continued, "the events of the past week, the murder of Lord Witherspoon, the peculiar symbols, the cryptic whispers, are not as unrelated as they may appear. In fact, they point to a single, orchestrated effort to protect a very old secret." Lady Eleanor glanced nervously at the ringmaster, who remained impassive, his face unreadable. "It became clear to me," Marple said, flipping through her notes, "that Lord Witherspoon had stumbled upon something he was not meant to see, something connected to the circus, though not the performance itself, but rather what lies behind it. A network of individuals who have for years worked in shadows, preserving their influence and their ritual." The ringmaster raised a hand, his polished tone breaking the tension. "Miss Marple, with all due respect, these allegations are preposterous. Rituals? A network? Surely this is the stuff of fiction." Marple's gaze lifted from her notebook, her expression unflinching. "And yet, Mr. Archer," she said, addressing him by name for the first time that evening, "your own testimony betrayed you." He stiffened, the smooth facade cracking just slightly. "Only you," Marple continued, "could have known about the symbols burned into the wood behind the stage. No one else mentioned them, not even the stagehands who set up each performance, because they were never meant to be seen. You described them, Mr. Archer, as if you had seen them many times before." A murmur ran through the small crowd. Lady Eleanor's gloved hand went to her throat, her voice faltering as she asked, "You mean to say he's the one?" Marple held up a hand to quiet the interruptions. "Patience, Lady Eleanor. Mr. Archer is involved, yes, but not alone. And here," she gestured toward Rafferty, "is the man who can confirm what I have deduced." All eyes turned to Rafferty, whose gaze remained fixed on the ground. The ringmaster narrowed his eyes. "Surely, Miss Marple, you don't mean to rely on the word of a man with his reputation?" "His reputation is precisely why his testimony is valuable," Marple said firmly. "Mr. Rafferty knows the rituals. He's seen them performed. He told me as much when we spoke. And now I ask him to tell you all." Rafferty's shoulders rose as he took a slow, steady breath. Finally he lifted his head, his face pale but resolute. "It's true," he said, his voice low but clear. "I've seen things I didn't understand at first. Symbols burned into the ground, strange chants before we opened the show. I thought it was just superstition, a way to ward off bad luck, but now I see it was more than that. Much more." The group was silent, their unease palpable. "Mr. Archer," Marple continued, her tone measured and deliberate, "you and a select few use these rituals as a cover, a way to keep certain operations hidden. But when Lord Witherspoon stumbled upon your activities, you panicked. The only way to ensure his silence was to make it permanent." The ringmaster's composure finally shattered. "This is outrageous," he thundered. "You have no proof." "I have Mr. Rafferty's testimony," Marple replied coolly. "I have the symbols, the stolen documents from Lord Witherspoon's study, and your own words. You slipped, Mr. Archer, and that is all I need." Lady Eleanor, trembling, stepped back from the ringmaster, as if seeing him for the first time. Rafferty, his hands clenched at his sides, stood taller than he had in days, his guilt now mingled with a sense of bitter redemption. The ringmaster's shoulders sagged, his anger giving way to resignation. He no longer protested. Marple stood, smoothing her skirt as she addressed the group. "Justice will take its course, as it always does, but let this be a lesson. Secrets, no matter how well hidden, have a way of coming to light, and when they do, they bring with them the full weight of truth." She turned and began walking toward the manor, her stride steady, leaving the suspects behind under the cold, watchful gaze of the moon. The air inside the drawing-room felt heavy, though not from heat. Outside the rain had returned, pattering softly against the leaded windows, casting rippling shadows on the walls. Agatha Marple stood near the fireplace, hands folded lightly, her expression unreadable. Before her, seated in a semicircle of armchairs and stiff-cleared chairs, were the suspects: the ringmaster, Lady Eleanor Pembroke, a few performers from the circus, and, standing to one side, Rafferty, the knife-thrower. He shifted uneasily under their collective gaze, his wiry frame tense and his hands curled into fists at his sides. The room was utterly still, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire. Marple had asked him to speak, and now all eyes were on him. Rafferty cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady enough. "I didn't think much of it at first," he began, his eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet. A few words here and there, passed along like some kind of old joke, a little gathering now and then, just for the crew, they'd say, for luck. He paused, running a hand through his hair. But it wasn't for luck, it was something else, something they'd been doing long before I ever joined. The ringmaster's face remained impassive, but a faint tightening around his jaw betrayed his unease. Rafferty continued, his voice gaining strength. At first it was all talk. They'd mutter about the old ways, about keeping the tradition alive. I thought they were just stories, nothing more. But then the symbols started appearing, on the wagons, on the stage boards, burned into the ground outside the tents, and the meetings got Stranger. The other performers shifted in their seats. One of the clowns, a wiry man with a perpetually worried expression, swallowed hard, as if recalling the same events. Rafferty glanced briefly at Marple, and she gave him the smallest of nods. "I didn't join in," he said quickly. "I didn't want to know. But I couldn't ignore it when people started whispering about sacrifices." Lady Eleanor's hand went to her throat, her face pale. "What sort of sacrifices?" Marple asked quietly. Rafferty's eyes darted to her. Nothing big. Nothing, human, at least. They'd talk about the blood of an animal, or sometimes they'd just leave something behind, coins, trinkets. It seemed harmless, but it was always done in secret, always with that symbol. "The symbol found at the murder scene," Marple said, her tone calm but firm. "Go on." Rafferty hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. "It was always directed by one person, one man who never joined the crew, but who'd show up at odd times, give the orders, make sure everything went according to plan. He wasn't one of us, not really, but we all knew better than to cross him." "And who was this man?" Rafferty took a long, slow breath. His voice was quieter now, as if saying the name out loud might summon the man himself. "It was Sir Julian Blake." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lady Eleanor clutched the arm of her chair as if she might faint. Even the ringmaster's cool facade cracked at last, his eyes widening in shock, or perhaps something closer to fear. Marple remained still, her expression unchanged. "Sir Julian Blake," she repeated. "The benefactor of the circus, the man who funded it from the start." Rafferty nodded, kept it all going. Made sure the money flowed, kept the crew loyal. If anyone threatened to expose it, like Witherspoon did, he'd step in. He didn't get his hands dirty, but we all knew he was behind it. We knew if we crossed him, we'd be next. Silence settled over the room. The rain continued its gentle patter, the fire its soft crackle, but no one spoke. Marple let the moment stretch, knowing that the weight of Rafferty's confession was sinking in. Finally she addressed the group. "So now you see," she said quietly, "this was never about the circus itself. It was about one man's control, his need to keep his secrets buried, no matter the cost." A gaze shifted to Rafferty. "And you, Mr. Rafferty, have done a brave thing by coming forward. It cannot undo the past, but it may yet set things right." The knife-thrower looked down again, his expression heavy with the knowledge that his role, however small, had been part of something far darker than he had ever wanted. Marple stepped back from the fireplace, her voice soft but resolute. "There will be justice now, for Lord Witherspoon and for anyone else who was silenced in the name of this so-called tradition. Sir Julian will answer for what he has done." The room remained silent as her words settled. One by one the suspects looked away, their earlier defiance and bluster now replaced by something quieter, something heavier. The mystery had unravelled at last, and with it their collective illusions of innocence. The drawing-room of Sir Julian Blake's manor was as grand as it was oppressive. Rich tapestries hung from the high walls, and polished walnut furniture gleamed in the glow of a crystal chandelier. It was a room designed for power, not comfort. On this particular evening, its plush chairs and ornate hearth provided little reassurance to the group gathered within. Agatha Marple sat at the centre of the room, her chair placed deliberately apart from the others, facing the semicircle of suspects and prominent townsfolk who had been drawn into the mystery. A fire crackled in the grate, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over the room. Marple's demeanour was calm but firm, her sharp blue eyes scanning the faces before her. Lady Eleanor Pembroke sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly around a delicate handkerchief. The ringmaster's smooth composure had faded into something more brittle. His polished cane rested against his knee, his fingers absently tracing its carved handle. Near the window, Rafferty lingered in the shadows, his face pale but steady. With a slight adjustment of her spectacles, Marple addressed the room. "What we must determine," she began, her voice measured, is whether the tragedy that befell Lord Witherspoon was the result of a broader conspiracy involving the circus as a whole, or if it was orchestrated by a single individual, someone who wielded influence both within the circus and beyond. The room was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the fire. Marple allowed the stillness to stretch, forcing them all to feel the weight of her words. On the one hand, she continued, we have the argument that the circus itself, its traditions, its secret rites, harboured a culture that led to this outcome. The symbols, the rituals, the whispers of an ancient cult, these elements suggest a deeply ingrained pattern of behaviour. Perhaps, one could argue, the entire company is complicit. Lady Eleanor gasped softly, her knuckles whitening as she clutched her handkerchief. Across from her, the ringmaster's lips thinned, though he said nothing. Marple turned her gaze toward him. Yet, on the other hand, we have the possibility of a singular mastermind, someone who used the circus's mystique as a convenient facade. This person, if they exist, would have the knowledge, the motive, and the opportunity to manipulate events for their own gain. It would be far simpler to direct blame toward an entire organization than to accept responsibility for a personal vendetta or an act of self-preservation. A murmur rippled through the group. One of the town's magistrates, seated near the fireplace, leaned forward. Are you saying, Miss Marple, that the entire circus may be innocent? That this could all rest on the shoulders of one individual? Marple met his gaze squarely. I am saying, she replied, her voice firm, that we must consider both possibilities carefully. The evidence, as you know, is complex. We have conflicting accounts, unexplained symbols, and a timeline that on the surface appears fractured. But when examined closely, these threads begin to align. Her words hung in the air, their quiet certainty drawing the attention of every person in the room. The magistrate leaned back, stroking his chin thoughtfully. The ringmaster's grip on his cane tightened, while Lady Eleanor's eyes darted toward the window as if searching for an escape. Marple rose from her chair, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She walked slowly to the fireplace, where the flames cast flickering shadows on the room's ornate ceiling. Turning back to the assembly, she continued, her voice softer now, but no less resolute. We must ask ourselves, she said, what the true cost of justice is. If we condemn the many, do we risk punishing the innocent? If we focus solely on one person, do we ignore the larger context that allowed such actions to occur? The room buzzed with murmurs of shock and apprehension. Some voices rose in anger, others in confusion. Loyalties were questioned, alliances strained. Lady Eleanor whispered urgently to the magistrate, her tone tinged with desperation. The ringmaster shifted uncomfortably, his polished demeanour slipping further with each passing second. Marple let the debate play out, her expression impassive. She knew that the truth, once revealed, would speak louder than any argument. For now, she observed, cataloguing each reaction, each slip of the tongue, each flicker of guilt or fear. When the voices began to quiet, she stepped forward once more. The truth, she said firmly, will become clear, but only if we are willing to look beyond appearances. The evidence is before us. We need only have the courage to see it. With that, she returned to her seat, her presence both reassuring and unsettling. The room fell silent again, the only sound the steady crackling of the fire. The weight of Marple's words settled over the group, and in that charged stillness the investigation took its final turn. The tension in the drawing-room was palpable, the weight of unspoken accusations pressing down on everyone present. Agatha Marple stood by the fireplace, her measured gaze passing over the gathering. Lady Eleanor sat rigid in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. The ringmaster leaned back slightly, his polished cane resting against his leg, though his hand gripped its head a touch too tightly. The other circus performers were scattered along the walls, their expressions ranging from nervousness to defiance. In the centre of the room Rafferty stood alone, his wiry frame casting a long shadow in the firelight. His face, usually guarded and impassive, now seemed haunted by a quiet resolve. He cleared his throat, the sound drawing all eyes to him. A few of the villagers shifted uneasily, others watched with curiosity, waiting for what the knife-thrower would say. Rafferty hesitated, his hands trembling ever so slightly at his sides. "I know what you all think of me," he began, his voice low but steady. "A drifter, a troublemaker, someone who'd do anything to keep his own neck out of the noose." He glanced at Marple, who met his gaze with a calm, encouraging nod. "And you wouldn't be wrong," he admitted. "Not about the man I used to be." His words hung in the air, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. The knife-thrower straightened his shoulders, his voice growing firmer as he continued. "But I'm not the same man I was when I first joined the circus. I've spent years trying to make amends, trying to leave that life behind, and yet no matter what I did, it always followed me. The whispers, the suspicions, they never went away. And now, with Lord Witherspoon dead, you've all had your chance to point fingers again." He paused, his throat tightening. "But this time I won't let it go unanswered." The ringmaster stirred in his chair, his polished demeanour faltering. "Rafferty, you don't have to do this." "Stop," Rafferty said, his voice cutting through the room with a surprising sharpness. He turned his gaze to the ringmaster, his eyes reflecting years of resentment and guilt. "I know what I've seen and I know what I've done, but this isn't about me anymore. This is about the truth." The room fell silent again as Rafferty's words settled over the group. He looked around, his face etched with both regret and determination. There was something happening behind the scenes. A lot of it started out small, just whispers, secret meetings. I thought it was just superstition, something to keep us together on the road. But it wasn't that simple. It never was. Lady Eleanor let out a faint gasp, her hand clutching the armrest of her chair. Rafferty hesitated, then pressed on. "There were symbols," he said, "burned into the wood backstage, drawn on scraps of paper left in our wagons. They said they were good luck charms, but they weren't. They were instructions. Maps, even. Directions to things we weren't supposed to know about. And when someone started asking questions, when Witherspoon started poking around, everything went south." Marple's pencil moved swiftly over her notebook. The others sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and unease. The ringmaster opened his mouth to speak, but Rafferty cut him off. "I didn't kill Witherspoon," Rafferty said, his voice trembling but strong. "But I saw who gave the order, I know who set the wheels in motion, and I'm not going to protect them any more." Marple's calm, steady voice broke the stunned silence. "And who was it, Mr. Rafferty?" Rafferty's gaze turned toward the back of the room where Sir Julian Blake stood. For a moment Sir Julian appeared as composed as ever, his aristocratic bearing unshaken. But when Rafferty's words rang out, a faint flicker of something passed across his face. Something close to fear. "It was Sir Julian," Rafferty said. "He's the one who called the meetings, he's the one who made sure we stayed quiet, and he's the one who couldn't risk Witherspoon bringing the whole thing to light." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Sir Julian's calm expression hardened, his voice cold as he replied, "This is absurd. A baseless accusation from a man with no credibility." "Enough," Marple said, her voice firm. She looked to Rafferty, her gaze steady. "Thank you, Mr. Rafferty. Your honesty will help us get to the truth." Rafferty nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he stepped back. His voice had shaken at times. His words had carried the weight of years of fear and regret, but now, for the first time in a long while, he stood taller. The truth at last was out, and with it the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The garden at Blackthorn Manor lay in solemn stillness. Moonlight spilled over the hedges and flower beds, casting soft silver highlights on the leaves and petals. The fountain, its quiet trickle the only sound in the night, caught the light in its arc, its droplets gleaming like scattered pearls. The house itself, with its towering chimneys and rows of darkened windows, loomed behind the greenery, a sleeping giant, oblivious to the dramas it had hosted. Rafferty leaned against a stone pillar near the edge of the garden, his outline dark against the luminous backdrop. The tension that had gripped him so tightly moments ago was ebbing now, leaving a hollow ache in its place. He could still feel the pressure of so many eyes on him, judging, questioning, condemning. But here in the garden he was finally alone. He took a slow, steadying breath, the cool night air soothing the heat in his chest. His hands, which had trembled during his confession, were still now, resting at his sides. He flexed his fingers once, testing the solidity of his grip. It was an old habit, one he'd picked up long before the circus, back when he believed he had control over his life. What had it cost him, this moment of honesty? He thought of the ringmaster's scornful expression, the disapproving murmurs from the audience, the sharp, cutting glances from those who had trusted him the least. Yet, beneath all that was something unexpected, a faint flickering light of relief. They know now, he told himself, they know the truth, and that truth no longer rests on my shoulders alone. It felt strange, that relief, mixed as it was with sorrow. He could not undo what had been done, the whispers he'd ignored, the warnings he'd dismissed, the signs he'd chosen to overlook, but at least now he had faced it. Rafferty tilted his head back and gazed at the moon. Its cool glow reflected in his eyes a mirror of the calm settling over him. He hadn't expected redemption to feel this quiet. He hadn't known that taking the first step would feel so much like standing on the edge of a cliff, one foot hovering over the abyss, yet somehow steadier than he'd been in years. The garden seemed to echo his thoughts. The flowering shrubs, some in full bloom, others on the cusp of wilting, were a living metaphor, their fragility and resilience bound together in a single moment. The faint scent of night jasmine carried on the breeze, blending with the earthy aroma of damp soil. "It's not the end, is it?" he mused silently. Confessing was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long. There would be questions, consequences, perhaps even punishment. Yet he no longer felt the crushing weight of helplessness. He'd made a choice to speak, to bring the truth into the light, and that choice had given him a sense of control he hadn't felt in years. A faint sound drew his attention, the rustling of a hedgerow, the shuffle of quiet footsteps. For a moment he stiffened, half expecting to see one of the townsfolk or a fellow performer come to confront him yet again. But no one appeared. The garden remained his, its serenity unbroken. He relaxed, his shoulders lowering as he leaned back against the pillar. He allowed himself one last glance at the house, at the windows now glowing faintly with candlelight as the occupants began to disperse. They would talk, or they would talk for weeks, perhaps months. His name would be dragged through every parlour and pub in the village. But that, he realized, no longer mattered. The truth was out, the shadows had receded, if only slightly, and the promise of redemption, faint but steady, glimmered in the moonlit garden. The drawing-room of Blackthorn Manor seemed to hold its breath. Its high, ornate ceiling loomed above the tense gathering, and the flickering light of a dozen candles reflected off polished wood and brass, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The room was filled with an air of anticipation, the kind that grew when truth hovered just out of reach. Agatha Marple stood before the hearth, her presence calm yet commanding. Her hands rested lightly on the back of a heavy armchair as she surveyed the assembled group. Lady Eleanor Pembroke perched stiffly on a settee, her gloved hands clutching a handkerchief. The ringmaster leaned against the far wall, his cane upright beside him, his face carefully blank. Rafferty stood slightly apart, his gaze low, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for the storm that was about to break. At the centre of it all was Sir Julian Blake, his posture as upright and polished as the room's gleaming sideboard. His expression betrayed no concern, only faint curiosity, as if he had no reason to expect what was coming. Marple spoke, her voice measured and steady. "We have now reached the end of our inquiry, and as promised I will present the truth. I ask only that you listen carefully, for once this web of deception is untangled, there will be no going back." The room was silent, except for the faint creak of floorboards as someone shifted in their seat. Marple's gaze moved deliberately across the faces before her, pausing briefly on Sir Julian's, though she gave no indication of what lay ahead. "We began with a murder," she said. A crime that at first glance appeared to be tied to the eccentricities of a travelling circus, a world of illusions and secrets. But the circus, as it turns out, was not the true source of those secrets. It was merely the stage. Her gaze settled on Sir Julian, who raised an eyebrow ever so slightly. The truth, she continued, lies in the connection between Lord Witherspoon and a very old society, one that some believe to be a thing of the past, a society that operated under the guise of tradition and spectacle, but whose true purpose was far more sinister. Marple paused, giving the words time to settle. The room seemed to grow colder, despite the fire burning steadily in the grate. "You, Sir Julian, were at the centre of it all," she said at last. Her voice was calm, but each word carried weight. "For years you used the circus as your cover, recruiting its performers into your fold and ensuring that their loyalties would not waver. You maintained your influence through a combination of wealth, fear, and the veneer of respectability. And when Lord Witherspoon stumbled upon your operations, when he threatened to expose the truth, you silenced him." Sir Julian's expression remained neutral, but a faint tightening around his mouth did not escape Marple's notice. He tilted his head slightly. "I must say, Miss Marple, these are bold accusations," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "What possible motive could I have for such an elaborate scheme?" Marple did not waver. "Power," she said simply. "Power and the preservation of your position. Lord Witherspoon was beginning to ask questions about the symbols found in his own study, symbols that linked back to the rites you conducted behind the scenes of the circus. He was preparing to publish his findings. That would have drawn the attention of the authorities, the press, and others in positions of influence. You couldn't afford that, so you had him killed and staged it to look as though it was the result of petty squabbles among circus performers." Lady Eleanor let out a small gasp, her handkerchief fluttering. Rafferty's gaze flicked up briefly, then returned to the floor. "And how," Sir Julian said, his tone still mild, "do you propose I achieved this? Surely you have more than just conjecture." Marple nodded, her voice never rising above its calm rhythm. "Indeed, I do. There is the testimony of those you once trusted. Mr. Rafferty, for instance, confirmed that the orders for certain rituals came directly from you. The documents found in Lord Witherspoon's study were signed with your initials, and the accounts of multiple witnesses place you at critical locations on the night of the murder." She stepped forward, her tone hardening ever so slightly. "Not to mention the discrepancies in your own statements. You claimed to have been at the estate all night, yet the staff recall you slipping out shortly after the main performance ended. When you returned, your jacket was damp from the rain, though the path from the circus tents to Blackthorn Manor had been dry earlier. You made a mistake, Sir Julian, and that mistake is what led me to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Sir Julian did not move, his expression unreadable, but his lack of protest spoke volumes. The room seemed to hold its breath once more, as if waiting for some unseen signal. Finally, Sir Julian leaned back in his chair, his hand resting lightly on its arm. "You have quite the imagination, Miss Marple," he said at last, though his voice lacked conviction. "A shame it will not hold up to scrutiny." Marple's eyes never left his. "The authorities will decide that," she said. "I have no doubt they'll find your motives, your means, and your opportunities as clear as I have." The room remained frozen, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. At last Sir Julian's carefully constructed composure faltered. His gaze lowered, his mouth set in a tight line. The web of deceit he had so carefully spun had finally unravelled, strand by strand. Marple stepped back, folding her hands once more. "This matter," she said, "is now in the hands of the law." As the villagers began to murmur and the suspects exchanged uneasy glances, Marple remained silent. She had done what she came to do. The truth had been revealed, the facade stripped away, and the mastermind unmasked. The case was closed, and justice, at last, could begin its work. The murmur of voices in the drawing-room faded to a subdued hum, as the constables stepped forward. Sir Julian Blake, once the picture of aristocratic poise, stood impassive, though a faint twitch at his jaw betrayed his tension. One officer read the charges in a low, steady voice, while another carefully bound Sir Julian's hands with polished steel cuffs. The subtle jangle of metal carried in the heavy silence. Agatha Marple stood by the tall, mullioned window, her slender frame silhouetted against the glow of the street lamps outside. The garden lay shrouded in a fine mist, the paths glistening faintly under the gaslights. She watched without comment as the two constables led Sir Julian out into the night, his polished boots crunching softly on the gravel drive. Her expression was calm, but her hands lightly clasped before her held a quiet strength. There was no triumph in her face, only a deep, measured satisfaction. This, she knew, was the moment she had worked toward from the start, when the strands of half-truths and whispers would weave into a single, unbroken thread of justice. The remaining guests and suspects lingered uncertainly, their earlier tension giving way to an odd mix of relief and unease. Lady Eleanor sat rigid on the settee, her gloved hands folded tightly over her lap. The ringmaster stood near the fireplace, his cane tucked beneath his arm, his gaze fixed on the floor. A few villagers whispered to one another, their expressions a mixture of shock and subdued gratitude. "It's over, then?" Lady Eleanor's voice broke the silence, wavering slightly. "Is it really over?" Marple turned from the window, her gaze softening as she looked at the older woman. "Yes," she said simply. "It's over. The truth has come to light, and justice will take its course." The room seemed to exhale as a collective weight lifted, though the lingering sense of loss was palpable. For all the tension and deception, a life had been taken, a stark reminder that even the most satisfying resolutions carried an inherent sadness. Marple returned her attention to the window, watching as the constables disappeared into the misty lane with their captive. Her thoughts turned to the events of the past days, the pieces that had fallen into place, the faintly scorched symbols, the hushed conversations. Each had been a step on the path that led to this moment. She had followed the clues with the diligence of a gardener tending her beds, knowing that even the smallest detail might yield the final bloom. "Justice is a patient gardener," she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible. "And though it is not always swift, it cannot be denied." Behind her, the room began to stir as people rose to leave, speaking quietly amongst themselves. The circus performers, their allegiances forever altered, moved together toward the door. Lady Eleanor accepted an arm from one of the town's aldermen and allowed herself to be guided out, her face still pale but no longer haunted. Marple remained by the window until the room had nearly emptied, the final constable tipping his hat before taking his leave. The drawing-room, now quiet and still, held a kind of peace it had not known for days. She sighed softly, her shoulders relaxing. Justice had been served, yet she knew the village would not forget this case so easily. St. Mary Mead's calm exterior had been shaken, its residents reminded that even the most idyllic surroundings could harbour dark secrets. But it was in that revelation, she thought, that the village would find strength. Truth, no matter how painful, had a way of clearing the air. It allowed people to rebuild, to see each other in a truer light, and perhaps to trust a little more deeply. Marple turned from the window, smoothing her skirt. There would be no grand speeches tonight, no declarations of victory. There was only the quiet satisfaction of having restored balance, and the knowledge that the world, however briefly, was a bit more honest than before. The circus grounds lay quiet beneath a soft, pale light as the first rays of dawn crept over the village. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and sawdust. The tents, once shrouded in shadow and secrecy, seemed transformed in the early light, no longer ominous, but warm and almost inviting. Rafferty stood near the edge of the main ring, his shoulders squared, his face lifted to the brightening sky. For days now he had been a man under scrutiny, weighed down by the doubts of others and the burden of his own guilt. Today, though, Something had shifted. He no longer felt the eyes of the troop filled with suspicion and distrust. Instead, they greeted him with tentative nods, small smiles, and murmured words of thanks. One by one, the performers approached him. The young tumbler, always quick to judge, now offered a hand in quiet solidarity. Madame Claudine, whose aloofness had once seemed unyielding, gave a brief but sincere smile as she passed. Even the strong man, who rarely spoke at all, clapped him lightly on the shoulder, a silent acknowledgment that things had changed. Rafferty, still a man of few words, simply nodded in return, but his eyes, shadowed and downcast for so long, now held something new, not confidence exactly, but a quiet resolve. He had faced his demons, and in doing so had found a path forward, not without pain, but with a glimmer of hope. Near the wagons, the ringmaster directed the troop as they prepared for the journey ahead. His sharp tone was tempered by a newfound respect for those under his charge. The tents would be packed away, the wagons loaded, and the circus would move on, not as it had been before, but as something closer to what it had always pretended to be, a family of performers, flawed but determined, ready to build something better. As the preparations continued, the sun rose higher, casting long, clean shadows across the grounds. The atmosphere buzzed with a sense of purpose and renewal, a quiet assurance that the worst was behind them. At a distance, Agatha Marple stood on a quiet lane, watching the scene unfold. She remained still, her hands lightly folded, her blue eyes keenly observant, yet softened by reflection. For all the tension and darkness that had gripped St. Mary Mead, the village was beginning to recover. So too was the circus, its spirit reshaped by the truth that had finally come to light. Marple's thoughts turned inward. The events of the past days had been a reminder once again of the delicate balance between light and shadow. Evil often hid itself well, cloaked in charm and respectability, while those who carried the weight of past mistakes were so easily branded as guilty. Yet even in the darkest of times there were choices to be made, moments when a single act of courage or a flicker of conscience could alter the course of events. She watched as Rafferty moved through the troop, his head held a little higher, his shoulders a little straighter. Redemption was not an easy path, but it was a possible one. No soul was beyond saving if it was willing to step into the light. And so, as the circus prepared to leave St. Mary Mead, Marple allowed herself a faint smile. The mystery was solved, justice served, and now the world turned towards something brighter. In the stillness of the early evening, St. Mary Mead seemed to exhale. The streets, which had buzzed for days with whispers of conspiracy and scandal, were now serene. Windows glowed softly, and the faint clink of teacups could be heard through lace curtains. The village had begun its slow return to the familiar rhythm of daily life, though something had shifted. The news had spread far and wide. Justice had been served, the shadows cast by a dark scheme now banished by the light of truth. But the echoes of recent events lingered, a faint hum beneath the quiet chatter at the grocer's or the taproom, murmur at the Green Man. Lord Witherspoon's name was no longer spoken in hushed, questioning tones. Instead, his memory was recalled with a mixture of solemnity and understanding, a man caught in a web not of his own making, whose death, tragic though it was, had ultimately unravelled the threads of deceit. Agatha Marple sat in her modest sitting-room, knitting in hand, though the needles moved more slowly than usual. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, drifted now and then to the window where a faint breeze stirred the curtains. Outside, the gardens of St. Mary Mead bloomed softly in the dusk, their colours muted but no less lovely. She thought back over the days of investigation, the subtle clues she'd gathered, and the faces of those who had been trapped by their own secrets. Rafferty's confession still lingered in her mind, his voice shaking yet resolute, the weight of his past finally shared, not to be borne alone. His journey had only just begun, but already it was clear he was stepping towards something brighter, something lighter. Marple's fingers paused, resting gently on the knitting. She had always known that truth, however long it might remain buried, had a way of finding its way to the surface. The lies, the red herrings, the half-truths that had swirled through the case, all of them had eventually aligned into a clear picture. It was a reminder of the fragility of deception and the enduring strength of clarity. Through the village, other lives carried on, shaped subtly by what had come to light. The circus troupe, now free from the shadows that had darkened their name, prepared for a new season with quiet determination. Their tents would be raised again, their acts performed under skies no longer tinged with suspicion. And in the heart of the village, St. Mary Mead's residents settled into their routines. They had learned, as they always did, that life could be both more ordinary and more extraordinary than it seemed. Their world was one of Sunday teas and garden parties, but also of hidden desires, unspoken fears, and the occasional startling revelation. She knew, as they all did, that there would be other mysteries, other secrets, other moments when the tranquil facade of village life would ripple and reveal the darker currents beneath. But for now, St. Mary Mead basked in the comforting quiet of resolution. The truth had emerged, as it always would, and the village, though changed, would continue, its gardens blooming, its cottages warm, and its people in their own way redeemed.